December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours, Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger's Maybach barked twice, coughed, and died. SS Oberst, Piper to his men, rapped his fist against the turret hatch. The hollow clang faded into the winter dark. In the driver's bay, Unterscharführer Weber thumbed at the starter again. Nothing. "Main tank reads empty," came the tight voice from below. A beat later, "Reserves dry too." Piper dropped from the commander's cupola, boots grinding on frozen earth. Around him, the armored fist of the Ardennes thrust. His Kampfgruppe sat stranded, dozens of panzers, scores of half-tracks, nearly 5,000 Waffen-SS troops, and no fuel. Through the gray mist he could make out the American positions at Hansfeld, abandoned in haste. Barrel fires still smoldered. Tin mugs of coffee steamed on crate lids, and beyond them, lined up in ranks as if staged by a mischievous god of war, jerry cans. Row after row of olive-drab American fuel cans. His adjutant, Hans Gruller, levered open a cap, sniffed, and flashed a grin. High-octane gasoline. Orders swept down the column and men sprang to work. Hoses appeared, funnels clanked against armor, and the air filled with the sharp bite of benzene. Piper paced the stockpile, counting and converting in his head. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of gallons, enough to feed the battle group for a hard push to the Meuse. Enough perhaps to bend the course of the operation. And yet, as he watched American petrol glug into German tanks, a different weight settled over him. If the enemy could abandon such quantities and keep moving, if what Germany guarded with entire divisions could be left behind like scrap, then the war's balance had already tipped. The Reich hadn't merely miscalculated, it had misunderstood. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Armaments Minister Albert Speer had laid a brutal ledger before Hitler. Systematic Allied bombing had gutted synthetic fuel output, the Reich's lifeblood. The Luna works, which had produced 175,000 tons in April, coughed up barely 5,000 by September. The hydrogenation plants at Pelutz, Bleckhammer, and Brooks limped at a fraction of capacity. The figures wrote their own epitaph. In that same year, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels of crude. Germany, counting synthetics and what remained of Romania, managed roughly 33 million, barely 2% of America's river of oil. The Third Reich was trying to fight a mechanized war with horse-drawn logistics. America, by contrast, was drowning its armies in fuel. Major Friedrich S., a logistics officer, had sketched the Ardennes math in blunt strokes. To reach Antwerp, the offensive would drink about 4.5 million gallons. Hitler had allocated 5 million. Only half ever reached forward depots thanks to transport chaos and air interdiction. The plan's core assumption, "We will capture what we need," was less strategy than confession. The Americans, meanwhile, were building pipes and roads out of thin air. Pluto, the cross-channel pipeline, and the Red Ball Express funneled supplies with industrial regularity, over 12,000 tons a day to the front. By December, U.S. forces in Northwest Europe were burning through roughly 1.2 million gallons daily and receiving even more. They fought while their reserves grew. Piper was no fool. At 29, a decorated Eastern Front veteran and among the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, he had learned that in modern war fuel outranked ammunition. His Kampfgruppe was designated the Schwerpunkt, tip of the spear for the 6th SS Panzer Army. At Tondorf on the 14th of December, 2 days before H-hour, General Sepp Dietrich hadn't sugarcoated it. "You have enough to reach the Meuse if you seize American stocks." Kampfgruppe Piper's official allocation, about 31,000 gallons. In practice, perhaps 50 miles of hard combat maneuver. The Meuse lay 60-plus miles away. Failure was baked into the arithmetic. So Piper wrote fuel into tactics. Tanks would road march in single file to minimize throttle wastage. Engines off for any halt over 5 minutes. Capturing enemy depots outranked all but survival. When the column rolled on the 16th of December, those orders rode with every vehicle. Now, in Hansfeld's fog, the first test had arrived. A gift pile of American jerry cans. Crews worked with the quiet urgency of men who understood what was at stake. Caps spun. Funnels hissed. Gauges crept upward. The Tiger's Maybach caught, settled into a bass thrum, and exhaust plumes hung in the frozen air like signal flags. Piper let himself exhale. The spearhead would move again. But the thought remained, cold as the Belgian morning. If the enemy could afford to lose in hours what Germany struggled to produce in months, then the outcome of this offensive, and perhaps the war, was already inscribed in logistics. The American machine was operating on another planet. That same morning, barely 20 miles from Piper's start line, Captain James Rose of the 743rd Tank Battalion jotted in his unit log, "Fuel resupply received, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage already full." Entry dated the 16th of December 1944. At 0530 hours, the German opening barrage for the Ardennes assault roared to life, burning through in 2 hours more ammunition than earlier war operations were allotted in total. Even so, the spectacle hit a mortal constraint. Piper's column did not move until 0700. Behind timetable, the moment tracks turned. The highways of German maps proved to be narrow rural lanes, many untarred. Within hours, armored vehicles built for the steppe were nose to tail in the Ardennes, snarled by mud, ice, and timber. At Lanzerath, the first intended bound, came the next surprise: a lone American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men, dug in and stubborn, stalled the strongest German armored spearhead for nearly 10 hours. Engines idled. Fuel evaporated. By dawn on the 17th of December, after breaking through to Hansfeld, the column had made barely 20 miles and drunk roughly 40% of its fuel. At that pace, they would coast to empty well before the halfway mark to the Meuse. Hansfeld site was not even a main hub, just a forward-class 30B fuel point supporting the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. Yet what lay there dwarfed a German Panzer Division's monthly allotment. "We found pyramids of jerrycans," Adjutant Hans Gruller would later say, 5-gallon tins stacked 3 meters high, stretching for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even bothered to fire them. The captured stock was a mix of high-octane avgas and motor fuel at 80-plus octane. German engines, especially the finicky Maybachs and Tiger tanks, were tuned for about 74 octane. Ironically, the American fuel was too refined, causing misfires in several vehicles. As men refueled, more revelations surfaced. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who could read English from pre-war work in his father's import shop, leafed through shipping manifests in the depot office. Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, then 400 miles by road to Hansfeld. 6,000 miles in under 6 weeks. "I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Piper," Hoffman recalled in 1976. "He read them twice, crushed them in his fist, and said nothing. His face went pale. We both knew exactly what it meant." Private Ernst K. found copies of Stars and Stripes dated 15 December, 2 days old, headlined with the opening of a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun pushing 300,000 gallons per day. One pipe delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Piper hoped to expend in the whole thrust. To grasp the shock, one must see Germany's fuel ledger by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had throttled synthetic output by about 90%. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of avgas. Pilot training fell from roughly 250 hours to about 60. The surface fleet largely ceased to sail. U-boats fitted snorkels to stretch diesel by lingering on batteries. Civilians had not seen normal automobile traffic since 1942. The Gestapo chased black market theft by the leader. Farmers reharnessed horses. Meanwhile, the United States produced about 2/3 of the world's oil. The East Texas field alone outpumped all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries ran so hot that companies experimented with new byproducts simply to use excess crude. With roughly 50,000 gallons seized at Hansfeld, the column surged. By midday on the 17th of December, they reached Bühlingen, netting more rations, ammunition, and, most crucial, maps pointing to additional U.S. fuel sites. Those charts carried a discouraging subtext. There was fuel everywhere. Depots dotted crossroads. First U.S. Army alone had on the order of 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Piper pushed on toward Ligneville, where his men would carry out the Malmedy massacre. 84 American prisoners murdered. Even that atrocity, he later claimed, was entangled with fuel scarcity. He said he would not waste gasoline hauling captives. By evening, the spearhead reached Stavelot, home to a massive American depot, over 2 million gallons on hand, enough to guarantee a run to the Meuse. But the U.S. engineers were already moving. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had a direct order: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot dump, about 2,189,000 gallons in jerrycans spread over 15 acres, was laced with gasoline trails. White phosphorus grenades were issued. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis hurled the first. The blast was instantaneous and towering. A wall of flame punched skyward, then ran across the field like a living thing. Within minutes, the whole yard was an inferno. When Piper's lead tanks crested the approach, a black column climbed 1,000 feet into the winter air. The fire would eat for 3 days. Enough fuel to drive Piper's formation to Antwerp and back turned to smoke. Der Obersturmbannführer stood on the turret and stared into the blaze. Unterscharführer Weber recalled. After a long time he climbed down and said, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to spite us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, the same calculus repeated. Engineers torched 1.1 million gallons at Trois Ponts, 2.5 million at Spa. In the first week, U.S. forces deliberately destroyed more than 8 million gallons, more than Germany had earmarked for the entire operation. That casual ruthlessness rested on a logistics engine beyond German imagination. The Red Ball Express had already hauled some 412,000 tons with roughly 6,000 trucks driving around the clock, each burning about 40 gallons a day. The trucking operation alone consumed more fuel than Army Group B received in a month. By December, Motor Transport ran roughly 230 truck companies on color-coded routes, delivering 20,000 tons daily, including about 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, 1st Army's chief logistician, noted on the 18th of December, "Fuel received yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Issued, 1,623,000. Net to reserve, plus 224,000. Pipelines were still more astonishing. Pluto's undersea lines pumped roughly 1 million gallons per day from Britain. Inland, the Cherbourg-Paris line moved about 800,000 daily. The Seine line another approximately 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were burning about 7.5 million gallons daily and receiving roughly 8.2 million. They fought while their stockpiles grew. On the 18th of December, as Piper pressed farther into Belgium, the numbers hardened into inevitability. At Stoumont they seized yet another dump. 5,000 gallons vanished in barely 3 hours of fighting. A Tiger could swallow roughly 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. The battlefield math did not lie, only hope did. Panther tanks averaged roughly 1.5 gallons per mile, and in the Ardennes hills and forests consumption spiked by about 40%. Oberfeldwebel Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, noted in his log, "By noon, the 18th of December, we had burned through 67,000 gallons since H hour and captured perhaps 55,000. We were running a deficit." Ultra traffic made the German predicament no secret to the Americans. General Courtney Hodges circulated a blunt order: "The enemy is critically short of fuel. Destroy any gasoline stocks at risk of capture." That same day, C-47s flew 316 sorties into Bastogne, delivering supplies that included about 160,000 gallons of fuel. The airlift to one surrounded garrison exceeded what Kampfgruppe Piper had on hand. By the 19th of December, as Piper's vanguard fought around Stoumont, the fuel crisis turned acute. Tanks were being abandoned not for damage but for dry tanks. Piper pooled what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one hard fight or a withdrawal, but not both. Allied planning, by contrast, ran at industrial scale. For January, Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons. The ask was approved without debate. American efficiency also came from standardization. Shermans drank roughly 0.8 gallons per mile versus Tigers at around 2.5. Fully loaded U.S. trucks returned about 8 miles per gallon. Parts interchangeability sped repairs. German units juggled a patchwork of captured and domestic vehicles with mismatched oils, fuels, and spares. French tanks wanting different lubricants than Panthers. Soviet trucks needing parts no German depot stocked, each incompatibility multiplying friction. On the 20th of December, a radio came in: "Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply. Continue with what you have." At a commander's huddle, one battalion leader was curt: "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The MOSI is 30. According to Adjutant Hans Grueller's later statement, Piper summarized the reality. "Gentlemen, we face an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this whole operation. What seemed a miracle at Hansfeld was nothing to them. We cannot win." Others reached the same conclusion. General Hasso von Monteffel later wrote, "When I learned the Americans destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our taking it, I knew the offensive was lost at birth." Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, captured on the 23rd of December, told interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We count by the liter. How do we fight such abundance?" By the 21st of December, Piper was boxed in at La Glaise, armor immobilized. American formations tightening the ring, including airborne and armored elements, had a combined one-day fuel allocation in the hundreds of thousands of gallons. Piper may have had 1,000 left. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home, "We've got Germans penned up who ran out of gas. The captain jokes we probably burn more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." U.S. mobility showcased war as industry. Patton's 90-degree turn to relieve Bastogne demanded approximately 350,000 gallons just to reposition, unthinkable by German standards, executed in 3 days. When skies cleared on the 23rd of December, Allied aircraft launched roughly 2,000 sorties. The fuel burn alone would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 is around 300 gallons per flight hour. B-26 is about 200. A single day of Allied flying burned more fuel than Germany had budgeted for the entire offensive. On the night of the 24th of December, Piper ordered his column abandoned and slipped out on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had crossed the line of departure, 39 were still technically serviceable but stranded. The crews destroyed them with whatever ammunition remained. Oberrichter Heinz Goll recalled, "We siphoned the last drops from every vehicle, perhaps 200 gallons in all." The Obersturmbannführer personally scuttled his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks in equipment undone by empty tanks. Roughly 5,000 men had set out with Kampfgruppe Piper. About 770 made it back. They had driven 60 miles, seized several depots, and, in the process, uncovered the scale of Allied logistics. Word of Piper's findings raced upward through the German command. On the 26th of December, Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed summaries of captured American stocks. His chief of staff noted the reaction. Model read the figures twice: 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, over 2 million burned at Stavelot, more than 8 million destroyed across the sector rather than risk capture. Then said quietly, "We are not fighting the same war." Briefed on the 28th of December, Hitler refused to accept it. Albert Speer later wrote that Hitler dismissed the quantities as propaganda. Shown photographs of the Stavelot inferno, he waved them off as cinema tricks. The ranks below were less diluted. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "The Americans destroy more fuel in a day than we are issued in a month. They drive tanks as we march. This war is lost." Fuel was only the most visible symptom of a larger reality. By 1944, the United States produced roughly half of the world's manufactured goods, rolling out an aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship about once a day, a tank every 7 minutes. Petroleum figures were crushing. United States approximate lon. 8 billion barrels. Soviet Union approximate lon. 110 million. Germany, including synthetic output, approximate larthi 3 million. Japan approximate lita 616 million. Combined Axis petroleum amounted to less than 2% of America's alone. After 1942, every major German operation was bounded by fuel. Every American operation rode on abundance the German planners could scarcely imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a telling incident on the 27th of December. A staff officer noted that poor weather had cut fuel receipts to only 500,000 gallons per day. There was brief concern, until someone pointed out that even this reduced flow exceeded the entire German allocation for the offensive. Prisoners taken in the Ardennes often seemed more stunned by American abundance than by American firepower. Watching GIs toss half-eaten rations, burn gasoline for warmth, or leave supplies behind did more to crush morale than artillery ever could. As one Obergefreiter told interrogators, "We knew your production numbers in the abstract. Seeing men waste more than we possessed made them real. Anyone who witnessed that casual surplus understood the war was hopeless. Despite censorship, that realization bled into letters home. A Feldwebel wrote, "Americans wash clothes in petrol, they give chocolate to dogs, they fire extra salvos for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." The psychological effect undercut the regime's racial myth bravado. How could decadent Americans command such wealth while the supposed master race scrounged for basics? At Nuremberg, senior German officers repeatedly cited logistics, especially fuel, as decisive. Field Marshal Keitel testified, "From 1940 to 41 we held operational advantages. By 1944 we could not move for lack of fuel while the Americans shifted armies like chessmen." Even Joachim Peiper, questioned about Malmedy, framed choices through scarcity. After the 17th of December, every decision turned on fuel. We could not maneuver, pursue, or withdraw as needed. They moved freely while we counted liters. Heinz Guderian later wrote, "Peiper's 50,000 gallons, a miracle for him, nothing to the Americans, signaled the end." The episode resonates because it marks the point where industrial warfare rendered romantic notions of battle obsolete. As Richard Overy has shown, by 1944 Allied to Axis output exceeded 5-1 across major categories. In petroleum it approached 51. Such gaps cannot be solved by tactics or training alone. The US built roughly 324,750 aircraft to Germany's approximately 119,000, about 88,410 tanks to Germany's approximately 46,857, and, most tellingly, refined about 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944, while Germany scraped together roughly 33 million. On the 24th of December 1944, as Peiper's remnants slipped through American lines on foot, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the scale finally crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons that morning at Hansfeld and cheered as if they'd won the lottery. By that evening, after Stavelot's 2-million-gallon inferno, they understood they had already lost. The Americans had so much fuel they could destroy what Germans would risk their lives to seize. Those 50,000 gallons were less than a U.S. armored division burned in 2 days, less than the Red Ball Express consumed in a few hours, a rounding error in Allied daily usage. General J. Lawton Collins later wrote that German raids on fuel dumps revealed a fatal misread. They assumed the Allies valued gasoline as irreplaceable as they did. They could not grasp that their enemy could torch millions to prevent a local setback. Operation Wacht am Rhein failed on the immutable mathematics of industry. The German effort burned roughly 2.8 million gallons, about 40% of their total allocation, with the balance made up by captures. In the same span, American forces consumed on the order of 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost roughly 100,000 men, around 800 tanks, and about 1,000 aircraft in the Ardennes. More crippling than the material, though, was the collapse of an illusion. Any German who witnessed American plenty grasped that they weren't fighting a conventional war. They were being ground down by an economy vast enough to waste what Germany could not even supply. Joachim Peiper survived the battle but was imprisoned for war crimes until 1956. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in France by unknown assailants. Years earlier, in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman, finding that fuel dump was the worst moment. If they'd run dry sooner, they might have withdrawn with some dignity. Instead, they learned their enemy swam in oceans of fuel while they scraped by in drops. They discovered impossibility. The lesson reaches far beyond World War II. In industrial war, logistics outruns tactics. Production overpowers courage. Abundance beats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 may well have been better trained and more seasoned. It didn't matter. American forces stood on the shoulders of a manufacturing base that could squander more than Germany could make. That truth was written in every jerrycan at Hansfeld, every gallon torched at Stavelot, and every pipeline stretching across France. As Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated, in December 1944, each U.S. soldier was supported by roughly 67 pounds of supplies per day, each German by about 3. Americans griped about waste. Germans would have called it unimaginable surplus. In 1984, 40 years later, veterans met at La Glaise, where a museum keeps Peiper's Tiger in the spot it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann stood beside it with Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the U.S. 30th Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was a tactical choice." Wortman gave a bitter smile. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How were we supposed to fight that?" Anderson went quiet, then admitted, "We had so much we never even thought about it." That exchange captured December 1944 in miniature. One side counted gallons, the other counted in millions. One fought for each can. The other could afford to burn lakes of fuel. The outcome was baked in. German war diaries from Army Group B make the point starkly. December 16th, offensive begins, fuel at tilde 70% of minimum. December 17th, paper seizes approximately 50,000 gallons. December 18th, multiple U.S. depots destroyed, 5+ million gallons denied. December 19th, fuel critical, units immobilized. December 24th, Pieper abandons vehicles, fuel exhaustion. Industrial arithmetic, not battlefield daring, decided the result. First Army's own tallies told the story. On December 16th, reserves stood at roughly 3.7 million gallons. On the 17th, engineers torched 2.2 million to keep it from the enemy. By the 18th, another 1.8 million gallons had flowed in, and by December 24th, reserves were back up to about 4.1 million. Americans handled fuel in the millions, almost casually, while German units planned around single jerrycans. Quality mattered as much as quantity. U.S. refineries using catalytic cracking turned out higher octane fuel more efficiently than Germany's hydrogenation plants. Widespread 100-octane avgas gave American aircraft a performance edge over opponents stuck on 87-octane synthetic blends. Additive packages, tetrathiol lead, ethylene compounds, detergent agents, were produced at scale in the U.S. Germany had no true equivalent. Ironically, many German engines tuned for lower-grade fuel ran poorly on captured American gasoline. Shortages reached down to every foxhole. Gefreiter Hans Müller noted on December 20th, a 30-kilometer march in snow because trucks had no fuel, past abandoned American vehicles idling just to keep crews warm. Medical services faltered too. Ambulances couldn't move, generators stayed silent. We had skilled surgeons and captured American supplies, testified Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting. But no petrol for ambulances. Men died who could have been saved by a 10-kilometer ride. These encounters wrecked propaganda about a soft, inept enemy. Troops who had been told Americans were weak now watched them burn more fuel than Germany possessed. Goebbels wrote on December 28th of sagging morale, letters from the front praising U.S. material superiority cut straight through the party line. The myth couldn't survive contact with American logistics, and the Bulge's failure left Germany with nothing but a fighting withdrawal. At Nuremberg, General Jodl put it bluntly. After the Ardennes, the outcome was settled. "We had played our last card," he said, and discovered the enemy held all the aces. By early 1945, the Allies targeted the Reich's fuel lifelines with single-minded purpose, and by February, Germany's petroleum output had effectively flatlined. The Luftwaffe sat grounded, flight training curtailed to nothing. Without fuel, the Wehrmacht stiffened into a static defense, dismantled in segments by opponents who could still maneuver. Spring brought almost unreal scenes, formations capitulating not because they'd been shot to pieces, but because they couldn't move. Major General Fritz Bayolin recalled, "We had 42 serviceable tanks, veteran crews, ammunition, yet only 300 liters of fuel. Not enough to reach the next town. We scuttled the tanks and walked into captivity." Across the lines, American columns stalled only when clogged by their own traffic. Third Army alone fielded roughly 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Piper's fuel saga underscored a larger law of the war: industrial throughput set the limits of strategy. Standing amid captured jerrycans that December morning, Piper glimpsed the truth. His enemy wasted more than his army needed. The arithmetic was merciless. German planners budgeted about 5 million gallons for the push. U.S. engineers torched 8 million rather than let it be seized. American forces burned roughly 7.5 million gallons each day. Piper's windfall at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons, was roughly 0.6% of a single day's U.S. usage. The Bulge cost about 19,000 American lives and perhaps 100,000 German, and it shattered the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves. but its enduring effect inside German ranks was psychological, first-hand proof that the United States commanded an abundance beyond comprehension. Piper's find was never just about gasoline. It exposed the nature of modern, industrial war. Victory flows to whoever can mass petroleum, steel, and aluminum at scale. By that metric, Germany had been out of the running since 1942. The irony endured at La Glaise. After the fighting, U.S. teams inventoried 39 intact German tanks abandoned for want of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage note was almost offhand. Fuel required 8,000 gallons. Classification: minimal. Source: local reserve. Time: 4 hours. What had been impossible for the Germans? Finding 8,000 gallons to save their best armor. Barely registered as a task for American logistics. That was the lesson of Hansfeld, not merely that the Allies had more, but that their scale rendered German scarcity irrelevant. Once U.S. industry was fully mobilized, the outcome was fixed. Hansfeld only made visible what had long been true. Germany was fighting the impossible, counting defeat by the gallon, while the United States measured victory by the ocean. Today, the Tiger at La Glaise sits with its needle on empty, a monument to the moment tactical prowess met logistical reality and lost. Visitors ask why such fearsome machines were left behind. The answer fits on a single line: no fuel. In industrial war, sometimes that's the only line that matters.